All right. Well, welcome everyone once again to another episode of Deliberations Live. I'm your host, Derek Caldwell. Here in the studio, we've got author, speaker, all around great guy, Abdu Murray, hanging out in Florida today. Abdu, how's it going down south?
It's hot. It's hot and sticky, but I actually like hot and sticky weather. People always complain about it when it gets like way up in Michigan, which is not a frequent thing, I think, compared to here. But it's going well. We're at the AAU National Volleyball Tournament. My daughter is playing. She's doing quite well. Had her first day yesterday. So if there are any college scouts who are watching, she's killing it. She's doing a great job. Had a great day of blocks yesterday. Some really great right side hits as well. So today is another day. This afternoon we're playing. I can't wait to watch her. I absolutely love these things, by the way. I love coming to her tournaments. People will see that I post on my socials about them, and I absolutely love them. They're one of my favorite things to do, and the family comes down. So we're excited to be here. And we're meeting people, by the way, some ministry people as well. So it's not all just fun and games. But
Yeah.
although that is fun, I do enjoy doing that too.
Yeah, I was going to mention too, we are, if anyone wants to join our prayer circle, we are praying right now that Abdu's daughter will reach the height of 6'3", perhaps
Yes.
6'5", would be even better, but
Yeah.
really take that game to a whole nother level. But
Well, she is 5'11", and she's only 14.
she's getting
so,
there.
Yeah.
She's
yeah,
getting there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to jump right in because we've got a lot to cover today, and we've got a hard out coming up at 12 o'clock. So
Yes.
we gotta really get in as much as we can. So today we are responding to two episodes of All Rise, actually, since we kind of got off a week. The first one is Bart Ehrman objects the Gospels are anonymous. And Ricky Gervais claims atheists just believe in one less God. So the first question that we're going to talk about is illiteracy, because one of the main objections, Abdu, that we got on our episode was essentially saying that we did not give enough weight to the fact that allegedly most people were illiterate in the ancient world in which the Gospels were written. One saying that we are almost accusing Bart Ehrman of plucking this idea out of thin air, and another saying that having interactions with Greek speakers would be a far cry from lending credence to the idea that they themselves held fluency in the language. Now, the first thing I noticed that I just would like to sort of point out is that we were not arguing anything about the literacy or illiteracy of most of the people.
Right.
That wasn't one of our arguments. We were talking about were the people as described in the Gospels as the authors and in the historical narrative, would they have necessarily been illiterate? And even if you were illiterate, would that have been a hindrance to getting your ideas put on paper or papyrus?
Right.
So that was essentially what we were talking about. But what do you have to say just to that claim too, that they clearly they would have been illiterate? That's sort of without a doubt.
Right, and this goes to the whole realm of overstatement, and this is something all of us have to make sure we are careful about. Is a couple of things. The overstatement made in the objection and the question, I think, is as I want to be fair to this, but I think it's mischaracterizing, as you pointed out, it mischaracterized the argument in the entire episode. The entire response was not, Ehrman's wrong. People weren't illiterate back then, and therefore these kinds of guys could have, anybody could have written these Gospels, and these guys doing it is just fine. That's not it. It's that these, as you pointed out, illiteracy means different things to different people, and because of that, it has different levels. You can be illiterate in one sense, which means you're not fully literary, or you're this literary genius, or a master of literacy kind of a thing. But it doesn't mean you can't read or write. So what I'm trying to point out is that when you make an overstatement, when you say something along the lines of, you're saying that literacy wasn't a problem then, and you're hand waving at this idea of literacy, that's an overstatement. But what's ironic is it's an overstatement about us making an overstatement. We're not saying no one was illiterate or that illiteracy wasn't as big of an issue or people weren't as illiterate as people might say. It's like, no, these particular guys, and we gave reasons, by the way, in the episode. We gave specific reasons why, whether it's Matthew, whether it's Mark, John, or Luke, why these particular people wouldn't have been quote-unquote illiterate in the sense that they don't actually know how to read or write or have any command of the language or if it's Greek or not. In fact, the point we tried to make, and I think that we still make throughout the video, which I don't think is in any question in any way challenged by some of the questions we've been asked, is given the level of the literacy that we think the disciples actually had, the sophistication of the Greek in the Gospels is exactly what you should expect,
right?
Given the literacy level of the disciples. Plus, you had other possibilities. You had scribes who could write these things down for them. You had you had people who could actually transcribe what the disciples were saying. Clearly, no one thinks they couldn't speak. Clearly, no one thinks they had no language skills. You could easily have seen people writing these things for them as they were dictating them. So there's no real problem here. And so the illiterate, no one was doing any hand waving at the illiteracy. We weren't like just saying, oh no, it's dismissive. We weren't doing that at all. In fact, we were trying to take it head on. And I think a good response would have been a little bit more along the lines of, do we have reason to believe that these particular disciples couldn't have written these Gospels, and challenge the particulars of the arguments we made, instead of saying we hand waved at it. We didn't hand wave at it.
Right, and one of the it looked like there was perhaps a Christian in the comments as well, kind of talking about that. If there was perhaps any hand waving going on, it was again on the literacy that might have existed, especially among Hellenized Jewish people who were, there was a whole body of very popular Greek Jewish literature at the time that comes down to us now in a collection that we call the Apocrypha now. Not apocryphal texts or apocryphal gospels, but just these Greek Jewish writings that took place in sort of the period between the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. So,
yeah.
So there was this sort of level of familiarity going on that may have, even come down to the disciples themselves.
Also, one other thing that I think is important to point out, and I was thinking about this at the end of the episode, was you do have a bit of a gap between when the disciples experienced the Jesus in his earthly ministry and the time they actually wrote. Now, I don't think that gap is nearly as wide as a lot of the more sort of critical scholars would say, or some of the late dating scholars would say. I think it's far less than that. But let's say you have a gap. Let's say that gap is between 15 and 20 years on the conservative side. Let's say it's even more on the more liberal side of it. That gap allows for a couple of things. One, it allows for education. Two, it allows for additional resources like the scribes and these kind of things. And three, it allows for the ability for the development of understanding of how this message can be translated into the Greek that we find it in, and these kind of things. So you're not talking about a bunch of 20-year-olds who were following a 30-something-year-old and wrote this stuff down necessarily as it was happening. Now, could that have actually happened? I mean, you watch The Chosen, for example, and you see Matthew writing everything down as it happens and these kind of things. And maybe amongst the disciples, given his profession, he was maybe the most literate one. And maybe that's a plausible way to look at it. And that should be a perfectly plausible explanation of what happened. We don't actually know. But what we do know is that these guys weren't writing this stuff down necessarily as it was happening in terms of their level of literacy at the age they were actually at. So one, we gave evidence for why they would actually be not completely illiterate, given the writers that we're talking about in terms of the disciples. Two, later on, given that their vocations had suddenly changed to basically message bearers, you would expect there to be some level of literacy increase, or at least bringing alongside of them resources to be able to increase that literacy. So if we have a picture in our head of Mark or Luke sitting down and writing this out himself, or her, in terms of on the actual papyri. Maybe that's true, but maybe it's the case that they had additional resources, but the message is still theirs. The message is still, from a Christian perspective, God-breathed and God-inspired, but it's still theirs. So that gap of time, I think, actually allows for more than just a picture in our heads of a bunch of guys who just heard some stuff and says, quick, get some papyri and get some kind of writing implement to write this down before we forget what it actually is. That's not how it went. And so this gap actually provides us with more confidence to believe that the level of literacy we find and the level of literary skill we find in the Gospels is exactly what we should expect if the people who are claimed to be the writers of the Gospel are in fact the writers of the Gospels.
Yeah, great point. Also, just want to add, our friend Gregory just said he's excited for this video, and since you're a Star Wars fan, he likes to think that you secretly give these skeptics Sith names, and I assume that makes sense to you, and I'm happy if it does.
Yeah, when I found out that you weren't a Star Wars fan or a Star Wars nerd like I am, I was a little bit. I almost didn't hire you. I thought that maybe we should reconsider this hire. That does make sense. I have to start doing that, Gregory. I haven't done that. I probably should start doing that, or maybe making some cool graphics in my spare time with. What's the word I heard someone say? A lot of these guys are apologeti.
There we go.
These apologetics folks are apologeti. But of course that sets them up as like they're the enemy and they're evil, and of course we don't want to do that. But it would be a fun exercise, Gregory. So thanks for the suggestion. I'm gonna sit down with my son, because he's also a Star Wars nerd, and go through that.
There we go. No, it reminded me, because embarrassingly, well, I'm okay with it, but yeah, you're a Star Wars fan. I had to admit to you I was a professional wrestling fan. And the first question we got here, actually, I almost brought it up, and I'm going to do it now. It reminded me of, so there was a wrestler named Rowdy Roddy Piper that was very famous for saying this one thing one time. I mean, he said he was kind of one of these funny guys. He's a bad guy, so he was funny. But he said, just when they think they have all the answers, I change the questions. And that's what the first objection sounded like to me. We've answered everything, so just pretend the question was not, the question was totally different. But
I love that line, by the way. That's one of those deeply quotable things. And then when you put the tagline of who actually said it, sort of the description is like, oh, okay, well, maybe someone else said that. I don't know.
All right, so the next one we got here again on this episode with Bart Ehrman is from YouTube user Roman Philosopher, and he said this. I'll just quote it in full. Papias is, as a source, is not very reliable and only survives via quotations. He mentions a Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew. Our Matthew was written in Greek. It's not the same text. Luke is only referenced in the pseudo-Pauline text, not in authentic Paul or in the Gospels. Add in that it's very difficult to date Acts earlier than 130. It very much seems anti-Marcion in its theology. Add in that the growing scholarly consensus is that the Gospel of Marcion was an earlier form of what we call Luke, with anti-Marcionite and other changes added mid-2nd century to rebut Marcionite, the Ebionite, and the Docetic theology that was popular in the 2nd century. So there's a lot of that. Yeah, there's a lot there. I've got some, because I knew that would be, we'd want to be succinct, so I jotted down some things, but I'd love to hear sort of what do you make of this sort of again, there's a lot here, but pick your first one. And also, just real quickly, I do want to mention that the pseudo-Pauline text thing that Paul only wrote maybe 6 or 7 of his letters, we are going to be addressing that at some point in the future. That's something Abdu and I have talked about. We're going to really look at that issue. And the dating of Acts to 130, Abdu, you may have some comments here, but we do have an episode coming out in 2 weeks of All Rise, or a week, it'll actually be next week, of All Rise, responding to some comments from Paula Fredrickson. And in that, we do talk a little bit about that, because she says Luke, Acts, Acts must have been written in the 2nd century, because Luke uses, or whoever wrote it, the person we call Luke, wrote use the word Christian, which we don't see until the 2nd century, and we do respond to that.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's part of this whole, like, you can't. It's hard to date it earlier than 130. You'll see the response in the Paula Fredrickson episode. So guys, do stay tuned, because Paula Fredrickson, who is a bona fide actual historian and New Testament critic and scholar, needs to be carefully and considerately dealt with, because her opinions are not ad hoc. There's not just some kind of pop thing. She's a real bona fide scholar. But I think that her you'll find in the episode, hopefully, you'll find that the statements there's a lack of foundation in those statements, but there's also a reality that that kind of dating, it's I wouldn't say it's ad hoc well, maybe I do say it's ad hoc. It's ad hoc in the sense that it's like, well, this is the first time this phrase has been popularized or found its way into the literature, but you're going to have it earlier than that in common parlance and the way people interact with each other. So it's speculative in that sense. It's like maybe it's because we find it in other literature around the 2nd century, and therefore, if it's in the Christian literature, it's in the 2nd century. Well, maybe the Christian literature was the first literature to actually popularize or use this term, especially since Christians were ones who were being called that as a pejorative, as an actual insult. So you'll get a little more detail in the episode on Paula Fredrickson. However, I think that a couple of things. One is, I think the comment from this questioner is one, it's stated almost nakedly. It's like it's hard to date Acts before 130. Now, I realize we're talking about YouTube comments and all that kind of stuff, so you're not going to give a dissertation necessarily, and I wouldn't expect it, and we certainly wouldn't read a whole dissertation in terms of that, but we would try our best to make sure we give the proper context to a person's question. So it's stated a little nakedly, without good reasons to think that, other than maybe it's got anti-Marcion leanings towards it. And so you can see that Marcion said this, and this is 2nd century kind of stuff. And so in order to respond to Marcion, you have the Gospel of Luke. We're interjecting anti-Marcionite ideas here. And so that must mean that Luke was written right around the time of Marcion, or right after Marcion's ideas were circulating. And I think that suffers from the same kind of speculative reasoning that Dr. Fredrickson will engage in with regard to the word Christian. You're presupposing that this has to be a response to Marcion, as opposed to maybe Marcion actually responding to Luke, or responding to the well-established Christian tradition that Marcion simply didn't like. And part of that establishment was based on the Gospels, including the Gospel of Luke. So it reads, there's a chronological bias. If you want Luke to be late, you'll see that there are anti-Marcionite elements in Luke, and therefore it must be either right around the time of or post-Marcion in 2nd century. Or you could also read it as saying that Marcion and his ilk are actually responding to an established Christian tradition that is based in large part on the Gospel of Luke. So it kind of depends on what so you have to, in other words, I think that's 50-50. Let's just say that's 50-50. You have to have independent reasons other than that to believe that Luke was edited so that he is, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback in my hearing myself again, I guess that's what I'm hearing. So sorry for the pause, guys.
Yeah.
You have to make that assumption. So if it's 50-50, you have to have
Lance,
additional reasons to believe why that's the case.
Lance, it's on the iPad up here.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone.
Sorry, guys. 1 second.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So.
Almost there.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't hear. Oh, there you go. I hear Derek. Okay, good. We're back.
Hi.
Hey.
These are some of the fun little things that happen when you're
when you're going live.
When you're going live, yeah.
You're bull riding. You really are bull riding with the technology, aren't you?
Yeah. Do you want to just restate a little bit what you ended with there when the feedback, in case others were a little distracted by the feedback. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a chronological bias that we have to address. Whether you're trying to date Luke to early, but in the first century, or you're thinking about maybe Luke is dated in the second century, and that's is that if you want to believe that Luke is, you're leaning towards Luke is second century, and then you find things that seem to you like, or even seem to multiple people, like there is something that's anti-Marcion. So Marcion was a guy who didn't necessarily have Christian Orthodox beliefs, and he was trying to come against and writing things against the sort of Christian orthodoxy established by the second century. You'd say, well, because Luke sort of responds to the Marcion arguments, that must mean that Luke was written right around the second century. That could be one way to look at it. That could be, but you'd have to make more of a case other than it seems to me that that's the case, because the flip side could be that Luke wasn't or the redactors of Luke weren't responding to Marcion. Rather, the Marcionites and Marcion himself were responding to established orthodoxy of the Christian faith that is established, at least in part, based on the Gospel of Luke. So then we could say that's even earlier than that. So that seems like, let's just give it a 50-50 chance that maybe it's after because it's got anti-Marcion stuff, or maybe it's before and Marcion's the one responding to Luke and the information we find there. So you'd have to come up with more information to actually establish the anti-Marcionite redaction of Luke, which I think there is either none or scant evidence for such a thing. And you have to respond to additional arguments for the early dating of Luke. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, in the episode, we actually did talk about why there's good reasons to believe that Luke was written at least before 64 AD or the mid-60s AD, because Luke doesn't include, the Gospel of Luke does not include the death of Paul. And it includes all these details about a lot of people being beaten and shipwrecked and whipped and persecuted and jailed and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And then Paul becomes at some point the chief focus of most of the gospel, the book of Acts, which everyone acknowledges is at least Luke chapter or Luke part 2. Mm-hmm. If Luke part 2 doesn't mention Paul's death, which, the gospel of, the book of Acts, then it was written before Paul's death, which is in the mid-60s AD. And if Luke preceded Acts, then Luke actually must be earlier than Acts. So I think there's a great reason to believe that not only was Luke not written in 130 AD or later, but you can have that and put it into the 60s, if not even earlier, maybe even in the late 50s AD, based on the fact that there are some missing things in the Gospel of Acts, which is Luke part 2, that we would expect you to include, given all the detail that actually you find in the book of Acts.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was just gonna add a couple things here too, real quick. Mm-hmm. One would be there are lots of texts that are lost to history that only exist in some quotations later. That it doesn't make them untrustworthy. It may not be what you would hope to have on a text, but in regards to Papias, and then you have some figures like Socrates, who wrote nothing, and whose everything he ever thought or said exists only in the writings of others, most famously Plato. Mm-hmm. And the other issue is that Papias says roughly the same stuff that Irenaeus says. Mm-hmm. So even if we did lose Papias, we would have the same content in Irenaeus himself. So we wouldn't have lost much. As far as go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I just want to just emphasize the point you're making here, and then hopefully I'm not stepping on the next thing you're going to say, but is that this historical reliability based on something surviving in quotations, does that make it that we have the original source of Papias, and therefore we would love to have that? Well, yeah, of course we would love to have that. Yeah. I would love that. I would love to have the original Gospel of Mark, for heaven's sake, or the original Quran, or the original Gallic Wars. I'd love to have a lot of original things, but that doesn't make them unreliable. It just means we have to account for that fact. That's it. But it doesn't make them unreliable. When we make them like wholly unreliable, I think we run some serious risks about basically jettisoning almost all of history that goes beyond 200 years in the past. So I think that your point is a very good one.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's another thing was we don't really know what they mean when they say that Matthew is written in the Hebrew dialect. Was
Yeah.
that Hebrew? Was it Aramaic? Was it a Greek text written with a lot of Hebrew sensibilities, not and using words that didn't need explanation, and like they did in other gospels, they got explanations for certain Hebrew things that weren't explained in Matthew because the assumption is the people he was writing to would have known what they were.
Right.
But even then, it may have been translated early on. So there's just a lot of, regardless, there was always one Gospel of Matthew that everyone identified as the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah.
So just to respond to that.
Well, I think that, and this is
Quickly,
important too to say here, I think, is that, and we don't ever want to go beyond our level of knowledge or information on something. I'm not aware of a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. That isn't to say that it doesn't exist. It's just to say that I'm not aware of it. Maybe I should be, and someone could say, "You dunderhead! It's obvious. It's like literally theology one or biblical criticism 101. There it is." I'm not aware of it. If in terms of an actual in Hebrew text of the Gospel of Matthew, that is some kind of early or important document. Do I doubt for a moment that there are Hebrew translations of the Gospel of Matthew? Not for a minute. My guess is that the Bible, the entirety of it, Old and New Testaments, have been translated into Hebrew. In fact, I know that for a fact because I can do it on my iPad right now and look one up. So that doesn't bother me. But I guess we would need more clarification on this question to be able to dive into it more. Is that are you talking about some kind of like, a couple of 1,000-year-old version of that? Because that was the only thing that would challenge it. You see, if you had a Gospel of Matthew that was written in Hebrew in the 1600s and it's somehow different, my response would be, and what does that mean? So what? I could write it in binary today, and it would be different. So what? You'd have to have it's got to be a competing gospel. It's got to be something that actually is competing for the attention and authorship. You got to put it into a timeline context for us. Now, maybe the person can do that. It simply hasn't provided enough information for us to be able to respond intelligently on this issue.
Okay. Yeah, and then just the last thing I wanna mention here is this idea of the growing scholarly consensus that Marcion was earlier is not a growing scholarly consensus. There have been more recent scholars saying it, nowhere near a consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And growing, if you mean instead of 2, there's now 4 people, it would be something maybe more akin to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the consensus is that it is a 2nd century writing that is editing the Gospel of Luke to fit with certain ideas that it has about Jesus and sort of the Old Testament God not being all that great and the New Testament God being much better. And the thing is, the interesting thing is the only information we have about the Gospel of Marcion, including the words that are in it, come from quotations within 2nd century church fathers. So they are the ones telling us this. We have no other frame of reference for it other than that. And it's interesting because the person who wrote this had an issue with Papias existing only in quotations, but that's all we have of Marcion, who some scholars are trying to say is somehow earlier, even though there's literally no evidence of that. There is one fragment of papyrus called P96 that has what some scholars think may be, and by some I mean 1 or 2, may be the Gospel of Marcion, but there's so little of it there, we really aren't sure if it's Marcion or Luke. And that dates from the 3rd century, so it wouldn't, even if it was Marcion, it wouldn't really do much to establish that it came before Luke.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of issues with that thesis of Marcion coming earlier.
Yeah, and you can't base an objection on such scant evidence, nor can or the rejection of something like that. We have to be careful not to call something the consensus of something or even a growing consensus. Words like growing consensus, and I'm not for a moment saying that the questioner is actually being disingenuous. I'm not saying that in the slightest bit. I'm saying that we, this person and us, you and me, Derek, and any
Yeah.
Christian listening to this, have to be incredibly careful with our use of words when it comes to things like this. Now, I've been careless with my words occasionally, probably even during the course of this broadcast, where I've said something that I probably would say, hey, I probably should change my mind on that thing. If I were to be asked, did you say this exactly? And yeah, maybe I botched that. But when we have words like growing consensus, that carries with it an authority and a weight. It's similar to people saying, well, I read a study one time that showed this. It's like, well, did it really show that, or did you read the headline of that thing? So we have to be very careful, all of us do, about growing consensus. Growing consensus would suggest to me that there's already consensus and it's getting stronger, versus there's a couple of people and more people are starting to agree with them. But again, remember, that could mean, like you just pointed out, that could be one or two people thought this, and now there's four people who think that, or who at least loosely agree. We have to be very, very careful with this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Before we head, we need to shift to Gervais now. We're about halfway through, so there were some comments I wasn't able to get to, but
Sure.
our buddy Flavio is in the chat here asking if there can we recommend any literature about the pseudo-Pauline letters, any good responses to that claim or anything like that. So we love hearing that from Flavio, who helps us out a lot with with the ministry. So it's awesome to see him there. I would just say, I've not read any specific monograph on that. I would recommend, Flavio, if you're close at all to a theological library, or a church that has a good library, or if you can look at Logos Bible software and potentially purchase stuff there, or find things even on Amazon. I would look at certain things like the Pillar New Testament Commentary Series, Baker Exegetical Commentary Series. There's lots of good commentary series. That's where I've gotten most of my information on that, is from commentaries on the individual books themselves, because that's probably where you're going to get the most detail about the debate, evidence for and against, and so on. But Abdu, what would you recommend?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would recommend on general ideas with regard to some of the things we've been talking about, and it's not specifically limited to the whether or not Paul wrote the letters that he actually wrote, or that Christians claim he wrote, but things like The Heresy of Orthodoxy by Andreas Kostenberger, I think is a great book to read, because it goes through all these ideas about there was these various competing Christianities for orthodoxy, and the one that we happen to believe now happens to be the one that won in the sort of a political debate. And he sort of debunks that idea based on the New Testament writings themselves and a couple other things as well. So The Heresy of Orthodoxy by Andreas Kostenberger is a really good one as a start. I think that another resource I would go to, and the name of the website is escaping me right now, but my friends Tim and Lydia McGrew, along with some other folks as well, who work with them, Jonathan McClatchy, for example, and a few others, have a lot of resources on what they call maximal data for the resurrection of Jesus. And a part of the arguments that they make, if I'm not mistaken, actually center on the fact that you don't have to rely on just the sort of accepted letters of Paul. You can actually look at other things as well and say these are actually written by Paul. They have a really great set of, I think it's called the Library of Historical Apologetics. So there's some really good stuff there in terms of whether we can believe that Paul actually wrote sort of the disputed letters, as it were. They remain disputed. Just because we're giving you resources doesn't mean that the dispute is illegitimate, or that these scholars don't really have a legitimate argument to make. They have a legitimate argument. The argument is legitimate. The question is whether or not the legitimacy actually carries the day. And I think, like I said, if you go to, boy, I wish I could remember the website, but there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of things that Tim and Lydia McGrew and some of their friends as well have on the reliability of and the authorship of the Pauline letters. But we're going to actually do something on this. We're actually going to do something. So stay tuned, and as we do our research and do our background stuff, we're going to continue to provide some more updated resources, because we have to do a little more to be able to say, hey, this is the resource right now. But sitting right here, right now, I wish I could tell you this is the document to go to. This is the one to go to. But try some of those resources out, what we just mentioned.
Hey, Abdu, is that by any chance the Library of Historical Apologetics?
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's historicalapologetics.org is where you can go there, and the McGrews are just two good people to sort of become familiar with. On these questions. So
lots of detail. They like to swim in the detail quite a bit.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for anything particular, chances are you'll find something.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump over to. We're going to talk about our video on basically mostly centered around a conversation that the comedian Ricky Gervais, who's an atheist, had. A video with him being interviewed by Stephen Colbert on his late night show, and Stephen Colbert is sort of perhaps maybe one of, if not the most famous Catholic, maybe only second to the Pope right now in America at least.
Yeah.
Joe Biden would probably be. Well, I don't remember if he's Catholic or not. I think he is, right? Yeah, he is. Yeah. So he might be up there too. But but they had a conversation. Before we get into a specific question, I know we had talked about maybe discussing Colbert's approach.
Yeah.
Was he too winsome? Was he trying to be too sort of deferential? And not that there's anything wrong with being respectful, but was he ceding? Was he giving away too much ground? And so I want, before you and I talk about that, in the comments for anyone watching, if you did see our episode of All Rise, or you saw that video with Colbert and Gervais talking, we'd love to hear what your thoughts on that were. His approach to that. Do you think he should have been stronger, more forceful? Did he do it just right? That's the way you engage with non-believers now. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know we'd like to chat about that. But
love to hear your thoughts on it. Absolutely.
I'd love to hear your thoughts. So. But before we circle back around to that, we got some responses from and some really thoughtful ones from a person named Tenesthia, and I don't know at all how to pronounce that. But this person did have some critiques. Won't be able to get to all of the comments, but. The first one he mentioned was that, quote, a Muslim apologist can give a nearly identical, he's saying, sorry, some context. He's talking about when we were saying that the Christian God is different than all those other gods, so you can't lump them into the same thing and say if you don't believe in any of them, then you shouldn't believe in this one either. We were saying, well, this God is different than all of the sort of capricious Greek gods that were just human projections and so on. And he says this, a Muslim apologist can give a nearly identical answer to you, for example. The revelation of Muhammad is unique, and the Quran is different from any other religious text. Of course, there are major differences between different God claims. Gaia is unique, as she was one of the only a few who was born out of the infinitely existing void realm of chaos. And then he ends with, differences are irrelevant to the many points that can be made. So he's still saying, overall, there's way more in common than they have different. So, you can kind of just give the numbers and say, that's the way I took it. You can give the numbers and say, if you don't believe in them, why believe in this one?
Yeah, and that's how I took it as well, and hopefully we took it the right way. A couple of things to say about this. Let me go first with this, is that if a Muslim could make the same argument that I made. Yeah, exactly, to a certain level, absolutely. Because Muslims, essentially what some would call Muslims and religious Jews would be what are called ethical monotheists. And because there is a relationship between the revelations, or the claimed revelations of the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran, because Muslims actually believe there's a progression going on there in terms of what we're learning about God, Muslims believe in an eternally existent, necessarily existent God who is the first cause and the source of all creation, just like Christians do. So that is a fundamentally different understanding of sort of the one less gods thing, whether it comes to Hindu versions of God or sort of the paganistic views of God, whether gods, plural, whether it's Zeus or Hermes or Aphrodite or whatever it is, or Marduk from the Babylonians and all this stuff. Muslims actually believe in a different sort of God. They believe in the kind of God who is necessarily existent, just like Christians do. And I would venture that Orthodox or conservative religious Jews would believe in the same kind of God. So that isn't that isn't the point, though. The point actually makes the point is that because ethical monotheists would believe in a necessarily existing God, that automatically removes a ton of different conceptions of God from the one less God thing. They're not the same. They're not even close to the same. So you narrow all these other versions of God down to these ethical monotheists. And maybe you could have Zoroastrians and these kind of things maybe also in there as well. But I think that that is a very different thing. And so this point doesn't really debunk anything we've said. When it comes to God's existence. Now, remember something. You have two phases here when you talk about this kind of thing. The first thing is to respond to, does God exist? And you can't debunk the existence of God by saying I'm atheistic about one more God than you are, because if when you add all these gods, for that statement to make any kind of sense, you have to be saying that all these gods are so similar that there's functionally or actually no difference between the God that you're accepting and the gods that I'm rejecting. I'm rejecting the exact same kind of God that you believe in, and you're rejecting all the exact same kinds of gods that I reject as well, but for some reason, for an arbitrary reason, you're ascribing this God to have more legitimacy because he happens to be yours. That's not what's going on, whether it's from an ethical monotheist or a Christian, Muslim, or Jewish standpoint. Now the question becomes, there is a differentiation. So we're talking about a God who is a necessary being. Do you have the same reasons to reject that God as you would to reject Zeus or Gaia? Because in fact, the comment itself from Thenistia says essentially that Gaia is unique in that she was only one of only a few who was born out of the infinitely existing void realm of chaos. But see, that's actually not that unique at all, because that's just like all the other Greek conceptions or even the Roman or the mystery religious views of these various gods that emerged from an eternally existent ether. Those are all dependent. They emerged from something. So Gaia isn't unique in any sense of the word, because that's exactly how the origin stories of almost all the other gods come about. What is unique about the monotheism of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, as the Bible teaches the theology, is that God never emerges from anything. Everything that does exist emerges from his will. And that is a fundamentally different, it's like photo negative of each other. If anybody's watching this and has any memory whatsoever of when we used film to film things, there were photo negatives, which were the opposite. If you looked at a film, you'd see that all the light areas in a photo are actually dark in the photo negative, and all the dark parts are actually light. It's the exact opposite thing. And so Gaia falls in line with every single one of these, the creations of these pagan gods, the origins of them. What is unique about the kind of monotheism that I think starts in the Bible and is then adapted, I think, by Islam later, is that there is a God who doesn't emerge from anything, and he's necessary. So this is a fundamentally different kind of being you have to deal with, which is the entire point of David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God. Because he's trying to point out that oftentimes critics who make these kind of arguments are fundamentally misunderstanding what classical theism actually teaches, what classical monotheism actually teaches. And if you're gonna attack it, attack the real thing. So that's why this is different, and that's why that argument does not work, because this conception of God is completely different than these other gods. So you're not atheistic about one more God than we are. You are atheistic to the extent that we are atheistic about all those other gods, but this one's different, and there's a reason why we believe in this one that's different than this other. So you can't use the same arguments to debunk the existence of this God that you would use for those other gods because they're fundamentally different things.
Right.
Now, you go one step further, though, and say, okay, now, if you believe in the existence of a necessarily existent being, or if you don't believe in him, but you're trying to discuss what would a necessarily existent being look like now that we've jettisoned all other possibilities, because I think those other possibilities don't make any sense, really. But now we have a necessarily existent being. Now you have to ask, would such a being actually exist for other arguments, for other reasons, yay or nay? And then, what is he like? And that's when you start to differentiate between the different forms of ethical monotheism and the various stripes that we have around here. So the point that we were making is that argument, I believe in one less God than you do, is basically hand-waving. It's too simplistic. It makes the task a little too easy. And if you make a task a little too easy, then chances are you haven't really understood your opponent's views as well as you think you do. I don't think I can bumper sticker argument my way out of an atheistic argument. If someone gives me an argument from atheism about why they don't believe in God, I can't bumper sticker my way out of that argument and really have thought that I gave the full shrift to someone's views on that. And I think that you have to go through this multi-layered thing of understanding, what do Christians really believe about God? What is unique compared to other conceptions about God? And then what is unique about the Christian view of this particular monotheism? I think you have to go through that level of at least those steps, at least those 3 steps.
Okay, great. Yeah, I hope that was helpful for anyone watching, but Tennessee, if they get back on and watch this follow-up. I want to get to one more kind of quickly if we can, and then talk about Colbert. I know we've only got about 13 minutes left, so we're going to see what we can do.
Yeah.
So want to spend a little bit of time on Colbert, but so we'll just get to one more question. He said, there's so many unfalsifiable assumptions that have to be made, I'm assuming for the theist, that I don't have to make. All forms of causality we observe exist inside of space-time. What does it mean to have a cause outside of a time or place? All forms of minds that we observe exist within a space-time, materially. I would argue against the attributes you define as necessary for a first cause of our observable universe. Timeless? Not necessarily. A space-time outside of ours could exist. Immaterial? Not necessarily. A material yet infinite universe creating space could exist, etc. Defining a first cause as existing because a first cause necessarily exists due to attributes you assign is question-begging. Now, real quick, I did just want to mention I've just started reading a book by David Lindley called The Dream Universe, where he, an astrophysicist turned writer who is sort of some of the assumptions that he's making here, Tennesthea is making in this comment, Lindley would have a problem with, because he is afraid that we've begun to trade in the scientific method for some older form of Platonic or Aristotelian philosophy, and that to sort of, and I don't think he makes this claim in the book, but to sort of get around some of the, especially some of the uncomfortable questions we have about beginnings. To the universe. So so there are some assumptions even there that are being made. So I would question the unfalsifiable assumption claim that he makes. But how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think we have to understand there's a two-faceted way to look at this kind of argumentation that we had made, that I had made specifically about drawing upon Leibniz's argument from contingency. Is that you do have to, at some point, I mean, when we look at the way the world actually works, is that you do have to have a stopping point at some point, because you can't have an infinite regress of causes, because you can never get to now. If you have an infinite regress of causes in the past, you can never start counting up to the point of now. It's just impossible to do so. And there's a number of other reasons why actual infinites simply, they're absurd. This can't exist, at least not within the time-space continuum we're talking about. So you have to have a stopping point of some kind. You have to have a cause of the universe as it exists now that is not contingent upon any of the conditions of the universe as it is now, because things can't create themselves. So so that's a sort of a way of deductively getting there. But there's also an abductive reasoning going on here, where an abductive reasoning is simply inference of the best explanation. And so what I find interesting about these comments specifically is that there are, the argument from contingency up until the point where you have a necessary cause, it isn't in any way relying on unfalsifiable assumptions. It's relying on logic, is that we currently see a universe that exists, and we can use definitions, which aren't question begging, they are just definitions, that we can, from the observable universe. I have a cup here. This cup is clearly and obviously contingent. It could have easily not existed. And so you have to find, but we are dealing with existence, and this existence just seems, by definition, to be the kind of thing that is contingent. It cries out for some kind of explanation of its own existence. And at some point, deductively so, you have to come to the idea that all things that are contingent, and it's very hard to think of anything that's not contingent except for two possibilities, must be caused by those non-contingent things. You see how you deduct all the possibilities to the point where you get to, these are the only two possibilities. One of those possibilities is abstract ideas or objects, and this is the whole Platonic thing we're talking about, like the idea of wisdom or the idea of creation or the idea of numbers or whatever. But these things aren't causative in themselves. They're not powerful in themselves. The number 7 doesn't bump into anybody. It doesn't cause anybody any pain. It doesn't create other number 7s. It doesn't do that kind of thing. So these ideas don't actually do things. They have to be instantiated in some way, in a causative way, and they're not. So all that leaves now, I think, deductively, once again, is something that is causative and has agency to it. And that thing causes these things. So I think that's a matter of that's not a matter of unfalsifiable assumptions. It's just a matter of deducting down to what is possible now. And what is possible is that you have a necessary, or things that don't have to be, that can exist in and of themselves without explanation. And I think at some point you run into a lot of basically bad options until you get to a good option, which is God. So I think that that's not unfalsifiable in the slightest, but we're just using logic to get there. We're not using unfalsifiable assumptions. We're actually taking valid assumptions and deducting what is possible. But we also have an abduction to the best possible, or the best explanation given what we know. And so what we do know from current cosmology, and this is not an argument from the gaps, this is not a God of the gaps kind of thing, this is based on observable data, this is based on what is observable now, and so we're making an inference, the best explanation, and we can infer from the fact that time, space, matter, and energy began to exist, that the thing that creates them is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. And so that is not in any way an unfalsifiable assumption. That is completely reasonable. That is a rational inference to the best explanation. Notice what's important here. It's not an inference to the only explanation. This is important. It's not an inference to the only explanation. It's an inference to the best explanation. And I think people, whether it's Christians or atheists or whoever, get this wrong. It does not have to be the only. That's a deductive argument, where you deduct everything away to this is the only way this could possibly work. And even those don't always work. They're themselves sort of the best possible option, or the most logical option, unless the premises are wrong. But abductive reasoning allows for the possibility they could be wrong. It just seems to be the best. The inference you can make is that a necessary being exists that creates everything. So it's not the only possible explanation, it's just the best one. Now, someone might say, well, then why should I have to believe in it if it's not the only possible explanation? Well, we do that all the time. Most of our reasoning is abductive. Most of the things we do, most of the decisions we make in life, whether it's who we marry, or who we're friends with, or what job we pick, or what retirement plans seem best suited to us, or what school we should go to, or what we should order at Starbucks. We make almost every decision based on an inference to the best explanation, not based on this is the only explanation possible. We don't do that with almost anything. And so it is completely, my point is, it's completely rational for the Christian. In fact, I would say it's more rational to take and say, I choose to believe something that is far more likely to be the explanation of something than hold out for maybe there is a space-time outside of ours that could exist and create time. Well, that itself is question begging, because if you're saying there's a space-time that exists outside of ours that could have created time, well, that's what I'm saying, is that it doesn't make any sense for time to create itself and then say, well, there's a thing that's outside of time that is a certain kind of time that can create, but you're engaging in an infinite regress of causes now. You're still doing the same thing. So if there is a space-time outside of ours that could exist, well, you have to explain how that seems quite contingent. If ours is contingent, why isn't that one contingent? And then you keep going back and back and back and back until you get a non-contingent, necessarily existent, non-time bound being that creates all the various kinds of space-times that you can be thinking about. In material, he says not necessarily, or she, I don't know what the gender is, but a space, they said not necessarily a material yet infinite universe creating space could exist. No, it actually can't, or likely not, because an infinitely material thing suffers from the same kind of deficits that a temporally infinite thing would create, is that you can't have an infinite regress of causes. And a material universe, an infinite material universe, would suffer from the same kind of problems that all actual infinities suffer from. So you can't have that either. And if you did, you'd have to have an explanation, because material universes are contingent, up for that one's explanation. You have to stop somewhere. No matter how many times you throw a possible explanation, if any of those explanations is contingent, and material and time-bound and energy-bound things are in fact contingent by definition, you have to end with an immaterial, enormously powerful, non-time-bound and non-space-bound being that is necessary. You're gonna, no matter how many things you throw at it, you're gonna have to get to a point where everything stops, and there has to be an uncaused cause. And so, I don't think that that any of these things escape that. And two, it's not question begging, because the question under consideration is, why is there anything rather than nothing? Why do contingent things exist at all? And the only explanation for the existence of contingent things is a non-contingent thing. That's not question begging. That's an inference of the best explanation. It's also deductive. It's actually deductive logic. Yeah. So it's not question begging in the slightest bit. We're asking the question, why do contingent things exist? And the answer is because non-contingent things exist, or at least one non-contingent thing exists, and that thing is causative and has actual causative properties. So it's not question begging in the slightest bit. It's actually deducting to the only answer I think that makes any kind of sense.
Okay. All right. Well, just real quick then, we just got a couple minutes left. I want to read off. Luella did say, when we brought up the Stephen Colbert thing, Luella responded with, I think we need to be careful about rabbit holes and sidetracks. Indeed, they can initiate some thoughtful discussion and fruitful research, but can ultimately be distractions. I don't think it's ever wise to ignore alternate theories, but context and facts are important.
Indeed.
So yeah, there is kind of a discernment issue there, where you kind of have to weigh what things do you go down, because again, it goes back to the Roddy Piper thing. Every time you give an answer, if it settles it, a lot of times they just change the question, and you really need to say, no, we can I will spend time with you and take one question at a time, but we really got to focus on this one right now. And often that is a tactic, even if it's not purposeful. That is a tactic that, when you are having these conversations, it's easy just to jump around to the next sort of powerfully rhetorical comment you have, and sort of bypass that. And if you're trying to be very winsome and look a certain way in this conversation, then you think, I just have to go where they go, because that's the kind thing to do. But what is your advice on how do you talk, especially now? It is so hard today to have these conversations.
Yeah. So, and this is based off of the fact that during the interview that Stephen Colbert did with Ricky Gervais, he's actually giving him incredibly good starting points and arguments, and Colbert clearly knows what he's talking about. He's read this stuff. It's not like he's just some guy who happens to have some ideas and off the cuff says some things to Ricky Gervais and asks him to respond. He clearly has some really good things he wants Gervais to respond to. And I got to say, honestly, I don't think Gervais actually does respond to them in any kind of substantive way. But because of time limits and because he's a friend and because he's got him on national television, if not international television, and he's a guest, he wants to be deferential to him. But Colbert does say something like, that's a good argument. That's good. That's really good. But it wasn't. It wasn't good at all. It was actually not. I don't think many atheists would think that that was a terribly good response. But Colbert does give him that. Now, the reason why I think that that's actually a bit of an issue we need to talk about is because with his platform and with his audience, there might be people who actually listened to that or watched that and thought that Colbert, who knows what he's talking about when it comes to this kind of stuff, he might not on other things, but I think on this kind of thing he does, conceded something. And therefore, he actually gave more shrift to an argument than he would normally give, and then therefore in the minds of other people, whether they're Christians or on the fence or whatever it might be, actually thought, oh, maybe that actually is a valid argument. And so that becomes a problem, because that's when you become, I don't want to say too winsome in one sense, because I appreciate why Colbert did it, and I think he was wise in that sense. And if I would ever err on the side of winsomeness versus sort of a harsh thunder at him kind of a thing, I would err on the side of winsomeness. But if I were to have that situation, now that I'm armchairing it, I'm sitting here back and I'm second guessing it, I think that I think it could be like that. Yeah, you know what? That's not going to work. But I'll let you, since you were my guest, I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll move on. We in our conversations can actually easily, I think, have deep conversations where we don't get sidetracked by rabbit holes. Or rabbit trails, but try to keep the main thing the main thing. And I think what we need to do is say, I appreciate why you're making that argument. I'm hearing, and this is a wonderful tactic to use, is I'm hearing this. Is that what you're saying? And try to be as fair as humanly possible in your response back, because oftentimes when people hear an argument back, they'll be like, oh, that does sound a little silly. And then they'll change it, sort of the Roddy Piper thing. I'll change the question to make it sound more reasonable. And that's a good thing, because now you're asking them and you're helping them to sharpen their thinking. And you want to engage with the best possible version of an argument, not maybe someone's misstatement of it or off-the-cuff statement, just like you wouldn't want that to happen to you. So I think we should err on the side of winsomeness, but we have to be careful, because oftentimes our audience isn't always our audience. If I'm in a crowd of people and I'm engaging with someone back and forth and a crowd is formed around me now, it's not just the person I'm talking to that I have to actually worry about. It's actually the audience that's around me. And so you take these responsibilities very soberly. That doesn't mean you should fear your way out of it, by the way. It means you should be extremely careful and say, I don't know, as often as you can. So say, I don't know, as often as you can when it's actually true. Be winsome, but don't be overly deferential. Don't give people a pat on the back by saying, good point, when it wasn't. One, that's bearing false witness. And two, that actually creates a legitimacy to an argument that other people might hear. Can you disagree, though, agreeably? We have to. We simply have to start getting better at that. We have to start doing that. Now, Sam, I want to jump in, Sam, because you jumped in a little on the late side. We did start earlier this time because I do have a hard stop that I told Derek was at noon. It's 12:03 right now. I have to go because we have a volleyball tournament to get to this afternoon. But here, let me say this, because your question is a good one, okay? Does that mean that we can't have dinners with atheists? I don't understand. I hope that's not true, and that's not what I'm saying, because I've had many a dinner with many a person who doesn't believe what I believe or doesn't believe in any form of a God of any kind. I think, no, that's not the answer. I think what we have to do is to actually say we want to have those conversations. We want to have those meals because we want to have mutual understanding. You want to engage in the best. You want to engage with the best possible version of a person's counter argument to your beliefs, not a straw man. So we can be specific and say, yep, I want to engage in what you have to say. I want to hear what you have to say. I would ask follow-up questions to get clarity and maybe challenge some assumptions you're making, but we can't just leave it at that. Now, does that mean you have to finish up a conversation every single time? No, there's a whole lot of to be continues. In fact, one of the best ways to create friends with people who don't believe what you believe is to say, you know what, I don't think we're going to agree on this one just yet. Why don't we do ourselves both a favor of ruminating on each other's positions, marinating in what we've both said, and then we're going to come back again another time. And by the way, you don't have to have that kind of level of debate kind of conversation every single time you meet with that person. You can talk about your favorite movies if you want to. But when you do have these deep conversations, and you should, as respectfully as you can, without compromise where you ought not to compromise, but being willing to listen to somebody and say, you know what, maybe there's a good point being made here. But you have to be careful. Discernment is incredibly important. And I think that's the watchword. It's discernment.
All right. Well, yeah, that's very wise, Abdu. Thank you for joining us from Florida. Thank you, everyone, for joining us from wherever you were watching from. Sam, unfortunately, we're going to be unable to get to some of the questions that we have in there now because we do have to close this down. But email us at mail@embracethetruth.org if you would like that answered, or you can wait for a couple weeks and you can ask it in the next live show that we do. Thank you also, Serpa, for your question. And the same thing goes for Morningstar. If you have follow-up questions, you can email us or join us in 2 weeks. And again, if you subscribe, you will see when we're going live. You'll get notifications of that. So yeah, we did have to go early a little bit today. So you're not crazy. We are on a little earlier, but we are very thankful for you guys getting on here a little bit earlier today to chat with us. Thanks, Abdu, and we will see you all in 2 weeks.
All right, guys. Thanks.